Hybrid Cloud Show, Episode 4. I'm Aaron.
I'm Gary.
I'm Sean.
And I'm Shane.
Welcome to the show about public cloud, private cloud, and everything in between. Our views here are ours and not those of our employers. So you may have seen there was an awful lot of discussion about an article on an empty S3 bucket that can make your AWS bill explode.
So this was a fun article to read because it can happen so easily to just anybody. The author was trying to work with an open source project, and in the default configuration for this project, they had an S3 bucket name. For those of us who don't know, when you have an S3 bucket, it is in a global namespace. So if you have a bucket named Billy Bob in AWS, then you are the only person who can ever have that bucket name in AWS. And it looks like the open source project didn't claim this bucket. And so when the author went, he was actually able to create this bucket and use it. And he left the bucket open for about 30 seconds and he collected about 10 gigabytes worth of data. That is a ton of data for 30 seconds. It means a lot of people out there left systems misconfigured and didn't bother to fix it. And what's more alarming is that within the data he recovered, he was able to find multiple companies' data inside of that bucket.
Yeah, and I think the other thing worth pointing out here is that even before he had that bucket open, he was being charged for it because there are a bunch of failed requests for 400-ish type errors that you get charged for historically at AWS in S3. If a request returns a 200 or a 400 error code, you get charged for that because AWS have had to process that request.
Just to clarify, if someone creates a bucket in an AWS account and they're responsible for the billing, if someone, a malicious actor perhaps, knows the name of that bucket, they can make any amount of requests they want and they will be charging you.
That surprised me, actually. I didn't know that. And I can sort of see it both ways, but credit to Amazon. They have come back with a couple of tweets from Jeff Barr saying that they're going to work on this problem and that they're going to resolve it so that unauthorized requests that customers did not initiate will be free of charge. So I give them credit for responding very quickly to this and coming up with a sensible response to what was, to me at least, the most surprising part of the article.
Yeah, we can always complain that cloud providers want to swallow all the money, but you know these systems are hugely wide, and these are strange and interesting edge cases where people are billed surprisingly. And I think AWS have responded in the right way for this one.
And refunded the money, which is great. So the next article I've got here is about building Bluesky, a distributed social network real-world engineering challenges. And this went through a whole bunch of stuff. What was it that caught your eyes?
So I think for me, this is a really interesting view into the journey of Bluesky and how they took what was effectively a startup with two people, and then suddenly some spaceman bought Twitter and the whole thing exploded. And they had to very quickly adapt to making Bluesky something that was scalable, cloud agnostic, that they could run on what I can only imagine was a shoestring budget. And yeah, I think it dives really nicely into something that I'm not too familiar with, which is the software architecture side of building something like this and how you break Bluesky up into component parts, allow it to be something that you can build and add features to over time. I think they were talking about like adding blocking in under a day or something ridiculous, which is a really quick time to be able to build a feature like that. And then they dive a little bit later into the fact that they had to migrate between different databases because they suddenly realized the database they'd chosen couldn't scale as much as they needed. And then how they made the stack a little bit more cloud agnostic so that they could move back to on-prem and I would imagine ultimately move to a little bit more of a hybrid cloud setup as things scale more.
I thought it was really interesting too, some of the discussions of how they approach the engineering itself. So I quite liked the way that they were talking about having a sprint on something, trying to bash out a version of the feature that they could then realistically compare to the state of the art out there at the moment and make sure that they were only trying to innovate in places where that had value. So I thought some of that side of it was interesting too.
It's very much a definition of agile development, isn't it? They talk about building, like blocking features overnight, as you say, surely that was a known issue that they could have delivered before releasing, but they obviously released, wanted to understand how much of a problem this is and realized that, hey, we've got to do an urgent fix. Let's get this out. So, I mean, fair play for just releasing and then iterating. Very agile of them.
Yeah, but move fast, break things, Shay. That's how these things work these days, right? You don't ever finish something. You just release an MVP crap version and then iterate on it overnight.
Fail forward, right?
Exactly. I think the thing I wish they'd gone into a bit more detail on was the moving from AWS to on-prem piece. They mentioned that they did things to make the stack more cloud agnostic. I would love more detail on exactly what they did to make it cloud agnostic other than move away from some managed services. I'd also like a bit more detail on what are the cost savings you saw moving to on-prem. They say they were over-provisioned in AWS. How over-provisioned were they in AWS? Did they do anything to try and tackle that before going postal and moving back onto on-prem? There's a lot of questions from the infrastructure side that are unanswered here that I really, really like to dive into at some point.
It seems a lot of this was driven by one of their, they call it a key hire of Jake Gold, who had a lot of AWS experience, came in and said, we need to pivot quick. And then they started by making it cloud agnostic, and they moved some things to other clouds. They specifically call it Vultr here. And then they said after that, they shifted more to a hybrid of on-prem as well as multi-cloud. Jake Gold has been quoted more than once with his tirade of how cloud spending has become outrageous. I would love to hear more about exactly what Gary is talking about how did he do it? And then not just how did he make that initial assessment, but then how did he leverage the tools they had to make sure that when they moved to other clouds, that they didn't fall into the same traps. That's always very valuable information for architecture.
So they call out in the article that when they first started building this, they were running Docker Community Edition on some EC2 instances, which to me doesn't feel like a particularly efficient way of running Docker at scale in AWS. So if it were me, I'd have probably looked to make some improvements there first, moving to something like Fargate, where they could have had much more scalability for much less price. They don't talk a whole lot about things like reserved instances, savings plans, running on Spot, which would have been probably quite a good thing to do for an architecture like theirs. And they also talk about moving away from things like RDS to SkillerDB, which I think probably is a big part of making the thing a little bit more cloud agnostic, because my understanding is that SkillerDB can pretty much run anywhere at this point. So I'm not sure what a lot of the rest of the heavy lifting would have been, but if they were just moving these VMs that were running Docker and these SkillerDB instances and moving from RDS Postgres to another DB engine, it feels like maybe they weren't making the best use of what the cloud provider had to offer, and the migration back to on-prem would have been relatively easy. I'm interested to see how they cope with some scaling challenges in the future as and when Bluesky grows as well, because they say we want to horizontally scale. We can bring in new servers fairly quickly. Well, not in 10 seconds quickly like they can in the cloud.
I saw that they mentioned the infrastructure as code service Pulumi, which was something I thought was interesting. It looks like a way of doing infrastructure as code in particular programming languages like Python. Is that something any of you have used?
I've not used it before, but I really like the idea of it. There's always a lot of stuff that you end up doing around the edges when you're using Terraform or CloudFormation or Azure Resource Manager, I think it's called, isn't it, in the Azure world?
Yeah, or Bicep, yeah.
And it's interesting that you can build infrastructure in a little bit more of a functional way. It's definitely something that after seeing them using it, I'm going to have a play with. Like, it was in the back of my head as something that existed, but it's probably worth playing with for sure.
Yeah, and if Phelan wants to, there's an AI assistant there to get him started.
Let me just close the tab. I'm never looking at it again.
This is just an open source equivalent to AWS CDK, right? Or like a vendor agnostic equivalent.
A vendor agnostic, I think, is fair. It's mostly competitive to things like Terraform, which I know a lot of people are looking into because of the Recon acquisition.
Well, that moves nicely into the next article, which is that Hashicorp has announced that it's joining IBM to accelerate multi-cloud automation.
Yeah, joining. They definitely just did that of their own free will, and there was no massive bag of cash involved anywhere.
No one has gotten rich from this. It's all altruistic corporate behavior, right?
I hate language like joining, when it's clearly just that you've sold your company or soul or whatever it is to IBM. I mean, this is just another one of these things, isn't it? That it's an open source project that's selling out. It's disappointing. I'm sure that people will be looking for an alternative.
So Hashicorp took Terraform, source available, as they like to call it. And I have a conspiracy theory. Hear me out. I think someone got very upset inside of IBM. And as soon as they saw the backlash and the stock plummeting, they said, we can take advantage of this. And he moved mountains to bring them in so he can eventually make Terraform open source again.
I wasn't ready for the make Terraform open source again.
The long play for IBM is to make everything open source again. It seems incongruent with their historical decisions, but maybe.
I did see in the IBM press release that the acquisition amount represents an enterprise value of $6.4 billion, and that they anticipate that the transaction will, I think that means, add to their EBITDA within the first full year and make them money in year 2.
Anyone got a positive spin on this?
No.
No.
On to some admin then. First, thanks to the existing PayPal supporters and our patrons. If you want to join those people, you can on hybridcloudshow.com/support. And for various amounts on Patreon, you can get either an ad-free feed of just this show or all the Late Night Linux family shows. And sometimes you receive episodes early. Now, this is a new show for us, as I've said before, and we are still trying to build our audience. So one of the most valuable things that you can do for us is to tell the people you think might be interested about the show and try and get them to listen. If you've got questions or feedback that you want to send to us, please do that. The address is show@hybridcloudshow.com. Charlie wrote in to ask, what are your thoughts on the deeply unsexy topic of cloud governance? How much do you want to corral developers into a centralized abstraction? Do you prefer a development anarchy approach? What are the pros and cons?
Maybe we should talk about what cloud governance is first.
I think it's a mix of a couple of things. There's the policy and compliance aspects that I see in there, and I see increasingly an element of cost control in there. Is that aligned with your views?
It's a lot of like audit logging essentially, and making sure you're tracking activity down in whatever workloads you're running to make sure should bad things happen or should that information be requested, you can provide it. Cloud providers have a lot of great tools that you can utilize. I know AWS provides a bunch. I'm sure everyone else does as well. One of the risks you have in putting all of your governance eggs in that basket is that not only are you locking yourself into that vendor from a governance perspective, if you want your things to be monitored by all that governance, you have to then use the cloud as well. So you're kind of double locking yourself in. So do think about that if you are going down the unsexy rabbit hole of cloud governance.
I think the other thing is the culture that comes with having decent cloud governance. It's not about just putting a policy on a wiki somewhere and hoping that people read it. It's about adopting a culture of no blame, and that sometimes the thing that is wrong is the fact that there wasn't a guardrail in place to not allow you to do the stupid thing. And I think that is probably, for me, the more interesting part of this. I can put 1 million guardrails in an Azure account or an AWS account to stop you spinning up something in a weird region or using an AMI that you shouldn't use. But actually, if you do that, how do I make sure that it doesn't happen again? And how do you come up with a culture that enables cloud governance to be successful?
Yes, I've seen a few different things here, like there's a good Azure policy system that lets you do some fun things and then have exceptions to policies and things. But I've also seen companies take a very old school approach where a lot more was managed centrally, and it was almost like your old school IT system where you request resources from a central team, and the central team does all of the interfacing and then just hands those resources off to you once they're finished. What's the right approach?
Well, isn't that just platform engineering?
Exactly.
Yeah. If I want a Kubernetes cluster, I'm going to go ask them to provision it for me. They'll make sure it's up to policy. They'll make sure it's networked correctly. And then my developers can use it without having to think of that overhead.
Yeah, if you're a platform engineering team, you want to be taking all this away from the engineers, providing them an abstraction that takes away all the governance policies that you need to have in place for them.
I saw some advice around golden images and policies that were trying to steer people away from things like using a golden image where you pre-bake images for use cases and move away from that to a more policy-driven approach where you're trying to codify what you actually care about. And I think the idea there is to give more power down to your developers and users of the infrastructure to be able to spin up things on demand. And I think there is an element of clouds pushing those workloads or those approaches to governance, because the more you democratize the ability to spin up resource, then that's going to reduce friction and consequently, increase cloud bills. But it will make it easier for people to spin things up themselves without having abstractions between them and the ways of using things.
It is a good approach, but I think the problem with that is then not giving the cloud platform team or the platform engineering team the ability to go back and reinforce those policies or change those policies. I've seen it quite a few times where they've had this sort of more democratic approach, I suppose, to the way that things should work. And what they've ended up with is one team are using Transit Gateway, one team are using VPC peering, one team are running Debian, one team are running Red Hat, one team are running Windows because they were allowed to and it met all of the policies. But then when you're looking at, how do we enforce patching or some other kind of compliance thing at scale, it makes the job of the team enforcing that governance a lot more difficult when you then allow that freedom across the board.
So then going back to the question, is the centralized abstraction the right answer, or is it some balance in between the two?
I think earlier on in my career, I might have been naive and felt like engineers should have all the autonomy in the world. But to Gary's point, it can breed chaos. And that might not necessarily be down to poor engineering practices. It might be your organization restructures, and a lot of snowflakes are now handed off to teams that have no familiarity with them, or other things outside of an engineer's control can happen to change the world. You can be acquired. So to say we should tighten this down because the engineers are going to screw things up isn't necessarily true. It might be to protect the engineers that you tighten that centralized abstraction.
You have to work with your engineering teams and your platform engineering teams. It cannot be this battle of I need control, give me control. It's finding the right layer for where your teams are on their journey. Some teams are going to be very senior and they will want all the knobs to turn, and you should be able to give it to them as needed. However, there are going to be some teams that require guardrails and won't be conscious of things like personal identifiable information and Part 11 compliance or whatever your regulation is. And so having the fine-grained control right of that is the day-to-day battle that is platform engineering.
Yeah, and I think, like I said before, it comes back to culture, right? If you build a cloud engineering community within your organization where you say, come and present us this cool thing you're doing in a sandbox environment, it gives you as the CCOE or platform engineering team the ability to think about all things that a developer or an architect might not think about in terms of governance, compliance, resiliency, all of those 5 pillars of cloud engineering and cloud governance that we're told to think about, but often aren't always thought about by people. So, like you said, Sean, you've got to have open conversations with the people doing the building. Enforcing policy for policy's sake rarely works well. I think if you can articulate why these things matter, have open conversations with people about how they can engineer with these things in mind, you're going to have a much better time in long term.
Yeah, I mean, if you turn that round and it's no longer about guardrails to be in the way of people, but it's actually encoding best practices into what people who are less familiar with the cloud are doing, then that feels like a much more positive way of saying a very similar thing to me.
Exactly right. As we move towards this you build it, you run it culture that cloud really instills in people and instills in engineering organizations, what you're actually wanting to do as a platform engineering team is set that team up for success, right? You don't want to have them come and be wrapped on the knuckles because they left some PII in an open storage account Or they didn't put highly available Kubernetes in. They just put everything in a single availability zone or something. It's about enabling developers to be as successful as they can to build and run their product. And sometimes that does mean a little bit more governance. Sometimes that does mean that things are a little bit process heavy before they launch. But ultimately, it probably results in them not being called at 2 a.m. when things break, which is probably a bit more of a positive story to sell them.
And does that cloud governance nearly always end up owned by the platform engineering team, or are you seeing it split into a separate function that just focuses on compliance and cloud governance?
I see it increasingly split off. Say, there are some customers that I work with where they have a central CCOE or central cloud platform team that makes these decisions with varying degrees of success in terms of implementation. But actually what I increasingly see is actually some of these things being factioned off into, we've got a team that thinks about FinOps, we've got a team that thinks about security, we've got a team that thinks about how we keep our resources resilient, we've got a team that thinks about how we stop ourselves locking into one cloud and make our platform agnostic. And these teams aren't necessarily dedicated teams, right? These could be, we've got an engineer in team A that's really interested in FinOps, and we trust them to make these decisions for the business. We've got an engineer in team C, D, and F who are interested in resiliency and security, and we trust them as our security guild to make security decisions for the business. And that's increasingly what I'm seeing. And then also what you're fostering there is a culture of developers as owners, rather than just having this central team who are making all these decisions that feel oppressive sometimes.
Yeah, I think that touches on a concept of inner sourcing, where platform engineering teams can really build a collaborative culture with the engineers, which is to say we have it's not open source, but it's internally everyone owns this, right? If you care about something and are passionate about it, submit a PR. Let's see if we can get costs down or get cost tracking better or whatever you care about. It's definitely the right approach to make sure everyone feels heard. And again, we're not oppressing engineers.
And have everyone benefit from those changes, right? Like if GP3 storage comes out or GP4 storage comes out and it's 20% cheaper for 99% of use cases, someone submitting a PR to go and change that one line to spit up new EBS volumes as GP3 or GP4 isn't going to hurt anyone and ultimately results in like a 20% lower cost for all storage going forward. It doesn't have to be platform engineering who are making that decision, right? As an engineer, you could see that, make that decision, because there's very little in terms of trade-offs there that you need to make.
I like that. I like that we're adopting not only open source technologies, but the open source mindset for internal projects and teams. I think that's really cool to see.
All right, we better get out of here. If you want to send in your questions, please send them to show@hybridcloudshow.com. We'll be back in 2 weeks. Until then, I've been Aaron.
I've been Gary.
I've been Sean.
And I've been Shane.
See you later.